London, 1817. They say a wedding day is the happiest in a woman's life. I discovered it can also be the most devastating. I, Catherine Pemberton, never imagined that my wedding dress would become a shroud for my dreams, that the words, "Till death do us part," would be desecrated before the sun even rose, that the deepest humiliation would come not from a stranger, but from the man who vowed to honor me. But what I truly didn't know is that destruction can be merely the prelude to redemption. This is the story of a woman who had her dignity shattered on her wedding night, and found salvation in the arms of the most feared man in London's high society. But before we dive into this story that defied the conventions of the Regency era, tell me, from what corner of the world are you watching me? Leave your comment, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell, because this journey promises to be unforgettable. Truth is always more fascinating than fiction. I should have known something was amiss when Henry's hand trembled slightly as he placed the ring upon my finger. At the time, standing before the altar in my family's chapel, I attributed his nervousness to the gravity of the moment. After all, marriage is a momentous occasion, is it not? The binding of two souls, two families, two fortunes into one unified whole. I told myself his distraction was merely the weight of responsibility settling upon his shoulders. How spectacularly naive I was. The ceremony itself was everything society expected, perhaps even demanded. The chapel was adorned with white roses and trailing ivy, their sweet fragrance mingling with the incense that drifted from the silver censers. My gown was a masterpiece of silk and Brussels lace, commissioned months ago and fitted to perfection. Every guest in attendance represented the cream of society, their presence a testament to my family's standing and the appropriateness of the match. I walked down that aisle with my head held high, my father's arm steady beneath my gloved hand. I smiled at the assembled guests, accepted their approving nods, and misty-eyed sentimentality with grace. When I reached Henry's side and turned to face him, I searched his blue eyes for some spark of affection, some warmth that would reassure me that I was making the right choice. I found nothing but cool politeness. Still, I pressed forward. I spoke my vows clearly, my voice steady despite the peculiar hollowness growing in my chest. I promised to love, honor, and obey. I promised to forsake all others. I promised to remain faithful until death parted us. And with each word, I genuinely believed I was embarking upon the life I had been raised to live, respectable, appropriate, and socially advantageous. The wedding breakfast that followed was a blur of champagne toasts and congratulations. I moved through the crowds like a porcelain doll, smiling until my cheeks ached, accepting well wishes from dowagers and debutantes alike. Henry remained at my side, the picture of a dutiful groom, though I noticed he drank rather more champagne than was strictly proper. His laugh, when it came, sounded forced and hollow. Several times throughout the afternoon, I caught him glancing toward the doorway with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. Anticipation? Anxiety? Or perhaps something darker, something that made my stomach clench with unnamed dread. The dancing began as the sun started its descent toward the horizon. Henry led me in the opening waltz, his hand at my waist feeling more like a restraint than an embrace. We moved through the steps mechanically, and I found myself counting the beats rather than losing myself in the music, as I had always imagined I would on my wedding day. When the dance ended, he deposited me rather unceremoniously with a group of matrons and disappeared toward the card room. I watched him go, that hollow feeling expanding until it threatened to consume me entirely. The hours crawled by with excruciating slowness. I made conversation I cannot now recall, smiled at jest I did not find amusing, and all the while felt the weight of expectation pressing down upon me. Everyone present knew what would come next, the inevitable conclusion to any wedding day. The moment when bride and groom would slip away from the festivities, when knowing glances would be exchanged, and when I would cross the threshold from maiden to wife in the most intimate sense. My mother found me as the evening drew late, her eyes soft with maternal concern. She squeezed my hand and spoke to me in low tones about duty and patience, about the importance of forbearance, and the rewards that came with time. Her words were kind, but they did little to quell the rising anxiety in my breast. Finally, mercifully, Henry appeared at my elbow and suggested we retire. The announcement was met with applause and ribald laughter from some of the gentlemen guests, laughter that made my cheeks burn with embarrassment. But I rose with all the dignity I could muster, accepted more kisses and congratulations, and allowed Henry to escort me from the ballroom. The walk to the bridal suite felt interminable. Our footsteps echoed in the silent corridors, and the distance between us might as well have been measured in miles rather than inches. Henry said nothing, his jaw set in a hard line that I had never seen before. When we reached the ornate double doors of the suite, he pushed them open and gestured for me to enter. I stepped across the threshold, my heart hammering against my ribs. The room was prepared for us, candles flickering on every surface, rose petals scattered across the bed linens, champagne chilling in a silver bucket. It should have been romantic. It should have been the beginning of our life together. Instead, it became the stage for my complete humiliation. Henry closed the door behind us with a finality that made me flinch. He stood there for a moment, his back to me, his shoulders rigid with tension. When he finally turned, the expression on his face was not one of desire or even affection. It was resignation mixed with something that looked remarkably like annoyance. Then he spoke, and his words demolished every naive hope I had harbored. He needed my dowry, he informed me with brutal efficiency. His gambling debts had mounted to staggering proportions, and without the influx of my money, he faced complete financial ruin. Our marriage was a business transaction, nothing more. I should not expect affection, companionship, or even basic marital relations beyond what was strictly necessary to produce an heir. Each word landed like a physical blow. I stood frozen, unable to process what I was hearing. This couldn't be happening. This was my wedding night. This was supposed to be, but he wasn't finished. With the casual cruelty of a man unburdened by conscience, he informed me that his heart belonged to another, Lady Isabel Morton, a widow whose charms had captivated him completely. She was waiting for him even now, in rooms he had secured for their assignations. He would be spending this night, our wedding night, with her. The humiliation crashed over me like a tidal wave. My throat constricted, my vision blurred. Tears burned behind my eyes, but I refused, absolutely refused, to let them fall in his presence. I had been raised better than that. I had been trained from childhood to maintain composure in any circumstance. So I stood there, silent and trembling, as Henry straightened his cravat and headed toward the door. He paused with his hand on the handle and glanced back at me with something that might have been pity, but looked more like contempt. He suggested I not wait up for him. Then he was gone, leaving me alone in that mockery of a bridal suite. For several moments I simply stood there, unable to move, unable to think. The candles continued to flicker, the champagne continued to chill, and I continued to exist in a state of shock so profound that I felt disconnected from my own body. Then I heard them. Footsteps in the corridor, firm and purposeful, moving with an authority that cut through my stupor. The door burst open without ceremony, without warning, and there stood Alexander Blackwood, the Duke of Ravenshire. I had seen him earlier at the wedding, of course. He was impossible to miss. Tall, dark-haired, with eyes like midnight, and a presence that commanded attention without seeking it. His reputation preceded him always. The Dark Duke, the ruthless businessman, the man who had lost his young wife to illness 3 years prior and had closed himself off from society ever since. Why he was in my bridal suite, I could not fathom. Why he was looking at me with such intensity, such barely restrained fury, I could not comprehend. But when he spoke, his voice low and dangerous, promising things I could not quite believe, my world shifted on its axis once more. He had witnessed everything, he informed me. He knew about Henry's debts, about Isabel Morton, about the calculated cruelty of a man who would marry for money and discard his bride on their wedding night. And he was offering me an alternative, one that seemed equally impossible and entirely necessary. The marriage could be annulled, he stated with certainty. It had not been consummated. Henry had abandoned me. The grounds were clear, but such an action would destroy my reputation completely unless I married again. Immediately. To someone whose position was so unassailable that society would have no choice but to accept it. To him. The silence that followed Alexander Blackwood's proposition stretched between us like a taut wire, vibrating with tension and unspoken implications. I stared at him, my mind struggling to process his words while my body remained frozen in the same spot where Henry had left me moments before. The Duke of Ravenshire was not a man one could easily dismiss or ignore. Standing in the doorway of what should have been my marriage chamber, he commanded the space with an effortless authority that Henry, for all his aristocratic pretensions, had never possessed. His dark evening clothes seemed to absorb the candlelight rather than reflect it. And his eyes, those impossibly dark eyes, held mine with an intensity that made it difficult to breathe. I should have been scandalized by his presence in my private chambers. I should have demanded he leave immediately. But the conventional rules of propriety seemed absurdly irrelevant given the circumstances. My wedding night had already been destroyed. What further damage could possibly be done? Finally, I found my voice, though it emerged far shakier than I would have liked. I asked him why. Why would he, the Duke of Ravenshire, possibly concern himself with my situation? We barely knew each other beyond the superficial acquaintance of society functions. What could he possibly gain from entangling himself in such a spectacular scandal? His expression shifted, something flickering across his features too quickly for me to identify. He moved further into the room, closing the door behind him with deliberate care. The action should have alarmed me, but strangely I felt safer with him present than I had moments before with my legitimate husband. Alexander explained with the same directness he had employed since entering. He needed a wife, or more precisely, he needed an heir for his dukedom. His first marriage had been cut tragically short by his wife's death from consumption, and he had avoided the marriage mart ever since, unable to stomach the calculating mothers and simpering debutantes who saw only his title and fortune. But the pressure from his family and his own sense of duty had reached a point where he could no longer ignore the necessity. I represented an opportunity, he stated baldly. I was well-bred, educated, and had already demonstrated the strength of character to stand before him without dissolving into hysterics, despite the evening's events. More importantly, I was in desperate need of rescue from a situation that would otherwise destroy me socially and personally. He proposed a marriage of convenience, honest, pragmatic, and devoid of romantic pretension. He would provide protection, security, and the position of Duchess of Ravenshire. In return, I would manage his households, serve as his hostess, and eventually provide him with the heir his title demanded. There would be no false declarations of affection, no unrealistic expectations of love, simply a mutually beneficial arrangement between two people who understood the transactional nature of aristocratic marriages. The cold practicality of his offer should have offended me. Perhaps, had this conversation occurred even 24 hours earlier, it would have. But standing there in my wedding dress, still reeling from Henry's casual cruelty, I found Alexander's brutal honesty strangely refreshing. He was not pretending. He was not deceiving me with false promises or romantic fantasies. He was offering me exactly what he said, nothing more, nothing less. I asked him about the annulment proceedings, about how such a thing could be accomplished quickly enough to prevent complete social ruin. Henry had left me mere minutes ago. Surely the logistics of dissolving one marriage and contracting another would take weeks, if not months. How could he possibly protect my reputation during that interval? Alexander's smile was thin and entirely predatory. He informed me that he had not achieved his position and fortune without learning how to move efficiently when circumstances demanded it. He had already set certain wheels in motion: conversations with influential bishops, arrangements with discreet solicitors, strategic applications of both wealth and pressure to the appropriate parties. Henry's debts were well documented, as was his relationship with Lady Isabel Morton. The grounds for annulment were unassailable. Moreover, he continued, Henry himself could be persuaded to cooperate. The man was drowning in debt, after all. A strategic payment to his most pressing creditors, coupled with the understanding that any resistance would result in complete social and financial destruction, would ensure his compliance. Alexander assured me he could be quite convincing when properly motivated. As for the timing, he proposed we proceed with remarkable speed. The annulment would be finalized within a fortnight, and we would marry immediately thereafter in a private ceremony. To the wider world, we would present a narrative carefully constructed to minimize scandal, a discovery of incompatibility, a mutual agreement to part ways, and my subsequent engagement to a more suitable match. Society would gossip, certainly, but the Duke of Ravenshire's involvement would lend respectability to even the most unusual circumstances. I found myself walking slowly to the chair nearest the fireplace, my legs suddenly unsteady. I sank into it, my elaborate wedding gown pooling around me like sea foam. The practical part of my mind, the part trained since childhood to navigate society's treacherous waters, was already calculating the advantages of his proposal. The Duke of Ravenshire was wealthy beyond measure, respected despite his reputation for aloofness, and powerful enough to weather any social storm. Marriage to him would not only rescue me from ruin, but elevate me to a position few could achieve. But another part of me, a part I had not known existed until that very evening, rebelled against the idea of entering another loveless marriage so soon after the first. I had spent mere hours as Henry's wife, but those hours had taught me the particular loneliness of an unloving union. Did I truly wish to commit myself to a lifetime of such emptiness, even in more comfortable and secure circumstances? Alexander seemed to sense my hesitation. He moved closer, not threateningly but with purpose, and crouched before my chair so that his eyes were level with mine. This proximity allowed me to see details I had not noticed before: the faint scar along his left temple, the threads of silver just beginning to appear at his temples, despite his relative youth, the deep shadows beneath his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and heavy burdens. He acknowledged that his proposal was not romantic. He made no false promises about eventual affection or growing attachment, but he swore to me, on his honor as a gentleman and peer of the realm, that I would never be treated with the cruelty and disrespect Henry had shown. I would be valued as his duchess, respected as his partner in managing his estates and social obligations, and protected from harm by the full weight of his name and position. Moreover, he added with unexpected gentleness, I would have freedom within our arrangement. He would not restrict my movements, dictate my friendships, or demand accounting of my time beyond what propriety absolutely required. I would be mistress of multiple estates, with considerable financial resources at my disposal, and the autonomy to use them as I saw fit. Many women in society, he noted dryly, would consider such an arrangement preferable to the alternative of a love match that constrained them to obedient submission. His words struck a chord I had not expected. Throughout my upbringing, I had watched countless women, my mother included, subordinate their desires, opinions, and very identities to husbands who claimed to love them while systematically controlling every aspect of their lives. The promise of respect and autonomy, even without romantic love, held its own peculiar appeal. I took a deep breath and met his gaze directly. I told him I would need certain assurances beyond his verbal promises. I would require legal protections, documents ensuring my financial security regardless of circumstances, guarantees that any children would be provided for according to their station, and clear delineation of my rights and responsibilities as his duchess. If we were to approach this as a business arrangement, then I would insist it be conducted with the same rigor as any other contract. For the first time since entering my chambers, Alexander smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his severe features into something approaching warmth. He inclined his head in acknowledgement of my request, and informed me that he would expect nothing less from a woman intelligent enough to be his duchess. We would have everything properly documented, reviewed by my own solicitor if I wished, and executed with complete legal precision. He rose to his full height and extended his hand to me. The gesture was formal, almost ceremonial, yet charged with significance. This was my choice, his posture seemed to say. He had presented his proposition, and now the decision rested with me alone. I looked at his outstretched hand for a long moment, weighing my options. I could refuse, attempt to weather the scandal alone, and hope that time and distance might eventually restore some measure of my reputation. But I knew, with grim certainty, that such hope was foolish. The Tun's memory was long, and their judgment merciless. An abandoned bride, her marriage unconsummated, and dissolved in scandal, would never fully recover socially. I would be forever tainted, forever relegated to the margins of respectable society. Or I could accept Alexander's offer. I could bind myself to another practical arrangement, enter another marriage devoid of romantic love, but with the crucial difference of honesty and respect. I would be the Duchess of Ravenshire, with all the protection and privilege that title conveyed. I placed my hand in his. The following days passed in a blur of activity that left me dizzy with its pace and efficiency. Alexander had not exaggerated his ability to move quickly when necessary. The morning after my disastrous wedding night, I woke in a guest chamber of my parents' home, Alexander having arranged for my swift and discreet removal from the bridal suite, to find solicitors already waiting to speak with me. The annulment proceedings were initiated with remarkable speed. Henry, true to Alexander's prediction, offered no resistance once presented with the alternative of complete financial ruin. His signature on the necessary documents was accompanied by a payment substantial enough to satisfy his most pressing creditors and purchase his cooperation. I never saw him again after that terrible wedding night, and I could not bring myself to regret his absence. My parents, understandably shocked by the rapid dissolution of my marriage, nonetheless rallied to support me once they understood the circumstances and Alexander's involvement. My father, after a private conversation with the Duke, emerged looking simultaneously relieved and impressed. My mother fretted about the speed of events, but could not deny the advantage of such an alliance. Society, predictably, erupted in gossip, but Alexander's stratagem proved effective. The carefully constructed narrative, emphasizing the incompatibility discovered before the marriage could be properly consummated, followed by my immediate engagement to a more suitable match, was just plausible enough to prevent complete scandal. The fact that the Duke of Ravenshire himself had involved himself in my situation lent credibility to our story. Few dared question his judgment openly. 2 weeks to the day after my failed wedding to Henry, I stood once again before an altar. This time, the ceremony was private, attended only by immediate family and necessary witnesses. I wore a simple gown of pale blue silk rather than bridal white, and the man standing beside me, speaking his vows in a deep, steady voice, was Alexander Blackwood. When he placed his ring upon my finger, a magnificent sapphire surrounded by diamonds that had belonged to his grandmother, I felt none of the naive hope that had accompanied my first wedding, but neither did I feel the dread and anxiety that had plagued me in Henry's presence. Instead, I felt something like cautious optimism, tempered by realistic expectations. We became husband and wife, under the eyes of God and the law, and when Alexander lifted my hand to his lips in a gesture of formal courtesy, I wondered what strange path had led me from one marriage to another in the space of mere weeks. The wedding breakfast was similarly restrained, a quiet meal with family, brief toasts, and none of the elaborate celebration that had marked my first attempt at matrimony. By evening, I found myself being handed into Alexander's elegant carriage, beginning the journey to Ravenshire Hall and my new life as a duchess. As we pulled away from my family's London residence, I glanced at my new husband. He sat across from me, his attention apparently focused on the documents he had brought with him, estate matters that could not wait even for his wedding day. The picture of a practical man, committed to his duties above all else. I settled back against the velvet cushions and watched the familiar streets of London disappear behind us. Whatever awaited me at Ravenshire Hall, whatever this marriage of convenience would become, at least it would be built on a foundation of honesty rather than deception. And perhaps, I thought as exhaustion finally claimed me, that was more than many wives could claim. Ravenshire Hall materialized from the morning mist like something conjured from a Gothic novel. We had traveled through the night, stopping only briefly at coaching inns for fresh horses, and I had dozed fitfully against the carriage cushions, while Alexander maintained his vigil over his endless correspondence. Now, as dawn broke across the countryside, I got my first glimpse of what would be my home. The estate was magnificent in a severe, imposing way. Built of gray stone that seemed to absorb rather than reflect light, it rose from the surrounding landscape with an air of permanence that spoke of centuries of Blackwood occupation. Tall windows gazed out like watchful eyes, and ivy climbed the walls in patterns that suggested both neglect and romantic wildness. It was beautiful, certainly, but it was a cold, austere beauty that offered little warmth or welcome. Alexander noticed my attention and spoke for the first time in hours. He informed me that Ravenshire had been in his family for over 300 years, passing from father to son through generations of Blackwoods who had served the crown with distinction. The current structure dated primarily from the 17th century, with renovations and additions made by his grandfather. It encompassed over 200 rooms, employed a staff of nearly 60, and generated income from tenant farms that stretched across 3 counties. The recitation of facts was delivered in the same businesslike tone he might use to describe any valuable property. There was no particular pride in his voice, no sentimental attachment evident in his words. It was simply information he believed I should possess as his duchess. The carriage rolled to a stop before the main entrance, where the household staff had assembled to greet their new mistress. I straightened my traveling dress and attempted to look like a woman worthy of the title I now bore, though I felt distinctly unequal to the task. Alexander descended first and offered his hand to assist me, and I was struck by how natural the gesture appeared, despite the businesslike nature of our arrangement. The housekeeper, Mrs. Winters, was a formidable woman of perhaps 50 years, whose sharp eyes assessed me with the thoroughness of a general inspecting troops. She curtsied with perfect precision, and welcomed me to Ravenshire Hall in tones that suggested she had reservations about my suitability, but was too well trained to express them openly. The rest of the staff followed her lead, a sea of curtsies and bows that blurred together in my exhausted state. Alexander introduced me to the senior staff with admirable efficiency, then informed me that Mrs. Winters would show me to my chambers while he attended to urgent business matters that required his immediate attention. He disappeared into what I would later learn was his study, leaving me to follow the housekeeper through corridors that seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions. My apartments were located in the East Wing, Mrs. Winters explained, traditionally reserved for the lady of the house. They had been closed since the death of the previous Duchess 3 years prior, and had only recently been reopened and prepared for my arrival. She pushed open a set of double doors to reveal a suite of rooms that took my breath away. The sitting room was decorated in shades of cream and gold, with furniture that managed to be both elegant and comfortable. Tall windows overlooked the gardens, and morning light streamed through them in a way that transformed the space from merely beautiful to genuinely welcoming. Beyond lay a dressing room lined with wardrobes and mirrors, and through another door, a bedchamber dominated by a massive 4-poster bed hung with silk curtains. Mrs. Winters informed me that my trunks would be unpacked shortly, and that a bath was being prepared if I wished to refresh myself after the journey. She also mentioned, with a certain carefully neutral tone, that His Grace maintained chambers in the West Wing. The implication was clear. We would not be sharing quarters despite our married state. This arrangement was apparently not unusual among aristocratic couples, she assured me, particularly when said couples maintained separate social and personal spheres. I thanked her and assured her the rooms were perfect. She departed with another precise curtsy, leaving me alone in my gilded cage. I walked slowly through the sitting room, trailing my fingers across furniture surfaces, examining paintings of landscapes I did not recognize. Everything was perfect, pristine, and utterly impersonal. These rooms had been prepared for a duchess, any duchess, but contained nothing that spoke to me as an individual. I was simply the latest occupant of a position that would exist long after I was gone. The thought should not have been as depressing as it proved to be. A maid arrived with my bath, followed by another with my trunks, and I allowed myself to be undressed and tended to with a passivity that would have alarmed my mother. I sank into the hot water and closed my eyes, attempting to process the extraordinary changes my life had undergone in such a short span of time. 2 weeks ago, I had been Catherine Pemberton, an unmarried woman of respectable family and modest prospects. Then I had been, however briefly, Lady Catherine Whitmore, a title that now made me flinch to recall. And now I was Catherine Blackwood, the Duchess of Ravenshire, mistress of this vast estate and wife to a man I barely knew. The absurdity of it all might have made me laugh had I not been quite so exhausted. After my bath, I dressed in a simple day gown and attempted to orient myself to my new surroundings. A young maid named Sarah, who had been assigned as my personal attendant, offered to show me through the house. I accepted gratefully, suspecting that without a guide I might wander the corridors for days without finding my way. Ravenshire Hall was even larger than I had initially realized. We walked through drawing rooms and parlors, a music room that echoed with our footsteps, a portrait gallery where generations of Blackwood stared down with varying degrees of severity, and a library that quite literally made me gasp with delight. The room was 2 stories tall, lined floor to ceiling with books, with a spiral staircase providing access to the upper level. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits. This, I thought, might be my sanctuary in this cold, beautiful house. Sarah informed me that His Grace spent considerable time in the library, particularly in the evenings. He was, she confided with the sort of loyalty servants reserved for masters they genuinely respected, a great reader. Poetry, philosophy, histories. His interests were remarkably varied. The late Duchess had rarely entered the library, preferring the music room and gardens, so His Grace had come to consider it his particular domain. I filed this information away, intrigued despite myself. Alexander had revealed so little of himself during our brief courtship, if one could even call our pragmatic arrangement a courtship. The idea that he read poetry seemed somehow at odds with the severe, businesslike man who had rescued me from scandal and married me with such clinical efficiency. The tour continued through dining rooms, formal and informal, a ballroom that could accommodate hundreds, and eventually to the gardens that stretched behind the house. These were somewhat overgrown, Sarah admitted apologetically, as His Grace had not entertained since his first wife's death and had seen no need to maintain them to their former standard. But even in their slightly wild state, they possessed a romantic beauty, roses climbing over arbors, paths winding between hedges, and a small lake visible in the distance. We were returning to the house when I spotted Alexander striding across the lawn with purposeful steps. He was dressed for riding, his dark coat molded to his shoulders in a way that suggested his tailor was an artist of considerable skill. He saw us and altered his course to intercept, dismissing Sarah with a brief nod. We stood facing each other somewhat awkwardly, husband and wife who were still essentially strangers. He asked if I had settled into my room satisfactorily, if the staff had been attentive to my needs, if there was anything requiring his immediate attention. His tone was courteous but distant, as though he were addressing a valued business associate rather than his bride of less than 24 hours. I assured him everything was perfectly acceptable. He nodded, seeming satisfied with this response, and informed me that he would be riding out to inspect some of the tenant farms, but would return in time for dinner, which was served at 7. We would dine together, he stated, as it was important to establish certain routines from the beginning of our marriage. Breakfast and lunch he typically took in his study while working, but dinner would be our opportunity to discuss household matters and coordinate our social obligations. The speech was so thoroughly practical that I almost smiled. Here was a man who approached even his meals as matters of scheduling efficiency. He took his leave and strode toward the stables, and I watched him go with a mixture of emotions I could not quite name. Relief that he was not demanding constant attention or affection, disappointment that he seemed to feel none, and beneath it all, a curious sort of loneliness that had nothing to do with being physically alone. The remainder of the day passed in a blur of domestic orientation. Mrs. Winters reviewed the household accounts with me, explaining the systems Alexander's first wife had established, and asking if I wished to maintain them or implement changes. I demurred, suggesting I should observe the current arrangements before proposing modifications. She seemed to approve of this cautious approach. I met with the cook to discuss menus and dietary preferences. I toured the wine cellars with the butler. I reviewed the schedule of social obligations Alexander had accepted on our behalf. Dinners, balls, a weekend house party in 3 weeks that we were expected to attend. My life as the Duchess of Ravenshire was taking shape with remarkable speed, and I found myself swept along by the momentum of it all. Dinner that evening was a strange, formal affair. We sat at opposite ends of a table that could easily accommodate 20, served by footmen who moved with silent efficiency. Alexander asked about my day, and listened to my recitation of activities with what appeared to be genuine interest. He then described his own day, issues with drainage on one of the farms, a dispute between tenants that required mediation, correspondence from his solicitor regarding investments in railway ventures. We might have been 2 colleagues discussing business matters, rather than newlyweds sharing their first dinner as husband and wife. Yet there were moments, brief, fleeting, when something flickered in his dark eyes as he looked at me, a certain intensity that suggested he was not quite as indifferent as his manner implied. When he helped me from my chair after the meal concluded, his hand lingered at my elbow a fraction longer than strictly necessary. When he bid me good night outside my chambers, his gaze dropped to my lips for the barest instant, before he mastered himself and looked away. These tiny moments of connection, or possible connection, left me oddly unsettled as I prepared for bed. Sarah helped me into my nightgown and brushed out my hair, chattering pleasantly about the household and its routines. When she finally departed, I climbed into the enormous bed and stared up at the canopy, feeling very small and very alone. This was my life now. This beautiful, cold house, this courteous, distant husband, this role of duchess that I had accepted as the price of rescue and respectability. I should be grateful, I told myself firmly. I should count my blessings and remember how much worse my situation might have been. But gratitude felt hollow as I lay alone in that vast bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of my new home settling around me. The days at Ravenshire Hall developed a rhythm that was both comforting and confining. I rose early, breakfasted alone in my sitting room, and spent my mornings attending to the myriad duties that fell to a duchess. There were menus to approve, household accounts to review, correspondence to answer, and social obligations to coordinate. Mrs. Winters proved an invaluable guide through these responsibilities, though I sensed she was constantly measuring me against the previous duchess and finding me somewhat wanting. Alexander and I maintained our pattern of dining together each evening, conducting conversations that were unfailingly polite and thoroughly impersonal. He would inquire about my day, I would reciprocate, and we would discuss matters of mutual concern with the efficiency of business partners. Then he would escort me to my chambers, bid me good night with perfect courtesy, and disappear into his own wing of the house. It was civilized, it was comfortable, and it was slowly driving me to distraction. I found myself increasingly curious about the man I had married. During our conversations, I began to notice small details that suggested depths I had not anticipated. The way his expression softened when discussing his tenants, particularly the families facing hardships. The dry humor that occasionally surfaced when he described various social absurdities we were obligated to endure. The surprising breadth of his knowledge on topics ranging from agricultural innovations to classical philosophy. He was not, I realized, the cold, unfeeling man his reputation suggested. He was simply guarded, careful to maintain distance and control in all his interactions. But why? What had created this fortress of reserve around a man who was clearly capable of much deeper feeling? My curiosity led me to make inquiries with the staff, though I tried to be subtle about it. Sarah, my maid, proved a surprisingly valuable source of information, as did some of the older servants who had served the family for decades. Through their careful revelations, for they were loyal to Alexander and would not gossip maliciously, I began to piece together a portrait of my husband's past. His first marriage, it seemed, had been a love match, which was unusual enough among our class to be remarkable. He had met Amelia Sutherland during his first season and had been utterly captivated. She was beautiful, accomplished, and vivacious, everything a young duke could desire. Their courtship had been brief but passionate, and their marriage had begun with great happiness. But Amelia had always been delicate in constitution. Within a year of their marriage, she had developed a persistent cough that no physician could adequately treat. The consumption had taken her slowly, painfully, over the course of 2 years. Alexander had nursed her himself, refusing to leave her side even when the doctors declared her condition hopeless. He had watched the woman he loved waste away, helpless to prevent her suffering, and had held her as she took her final breath. The tragedy had transformed him. The open, passionate young man had withdrawn into himself, building walls that no one had been able to breach since. He had thrown himself into managing his estates with almost obsessive dedication, working from dawn until well past midnight, as though constant activity could keep grief at bay. Learning this made me view Alexander with new eyes. His emotional distance was not callousness, but self-protection. He had loved deeply once, and had been devastated by loss. Our marriage of convenience, with its carefully maintained boundaries and lack of emotional entanglement, was precisely what he needed, a practical arrangement that fulfilled his duties without risking his heart. I should have been content with this understanding. After all, had we not agreed to exactly such an arrangement? Yet I found myself increasingly dissatisfied with the limitations we had set. It was the library that became my refuge, and, inadvertently, the setting for my growing fascination with Alexander. I began spending my afternoons there, drawn by the magnificent collection and the peaceful atmosphere. I would curl into one of the comfortable chairs near the window and lose myself in novels and poetry, grateful for the escape from the careful formality of my daily existence. One afternoon, perhaps 3 weeks into my residence at Ravenshire Hall, I was so absorbed in a volume of Byron's poetry that I did not hear Alexander enter. I only became aware of his presence when he cleared his throat softly, causing me to start and nearly drop the book. He apologized for disturbing me, but his attention had been caught by the book in my hands. He asked, with what seemed like genuine interest, if I enjoyed Byron's work. I admitted that I did, though I found some of his more cynical passages difficult to reconcile with his obviously romantic sensibilities. For the first time since our marriage, Alexander smiled, truly smiled, with warmth that transformed his entire countenance. He agreed with my assessment, and confessed that Byron was among his favorite poets, despite the man's notorious personal failings. We fell into a discussion of poetry that stretched for over an hour, ranging from Byron to Wordsworth, to the emerging romantics. Alexander proved remarkably well-read, and possessed insights that challenged and delighted me. When he finally excused himself to attend to business matters, I remained in my chair, feeling as though something fundamental had shifted between us. We had connected, however briefly, over shared interests rather than mere domestic practicalities, and I found myself hoping it might happen again. It did, with increasing frequency. Alexander began joining me in the library more often, sometimes reading in companionable silence, sometimes engaging in conversations that revealed more of his character with each exchange. I learned that he found social gatherings tedious, but endured them out of duty, that he believed strongly in the responsibilities of privilege and took seriously his obligations to those who depended on him, that he had traveled extensively through Europe before his first marriage and harbored a secret desire to see Egypt and the ancient pyramids. These revelations were offered cautiously, as though he was testing whether they would be received and valued. I treasured each one, storing them away like precious gifts. I began to notice other things as well, small gestures that suggested Alexander was not quite as indifferent to me as his manner suggested. The way he ensured the fire was properly stoked in any room I occupied, anticipating my tendency toward coldness. How he had arranged for the library to receive several new volumes he thought might interest me, including a rare edition of medieval poetry I had mentioned admiring. The protective way he positioned himself at social gatherings, subtly deflecting anyone whose attention toward me seemed inappropriate or unwelcome. And there were moments of physical awareness that neither of us acknowledged, but both clearly felt. When he helped me into the carriage, his hands would linger at my waist. When we walked together through the gardens, our shoulders would brush, and neither of us would move away. Once, when I stumbled slightly on uneven ground, he caught me against his chest, and for several heartbeats we stood frozen, his arms around me, my hands pressed against the solid warmth of him, before propriety demanded we separate. These incidents left me flustered and confused. Our arrangement was supposed to be practical, free from romantic complications. Yet I found myself thinking about Alexander with increasing frequency, wondering what thoughts occupied him during his long hours of work, imagining what it might be like to truly know him beyond the carefully maintained facade. I also began to observe his acts of kindness when he thought himself unobserved. One morning, while walking through the village adjacent to the estate, I saw him stop to speak with an elderly tenant farmer. Through discreet inquiry afterward, I learned that the man's son had been injured and could not work. Alexander had personally ensured the family would not suffer financially during the recovery period, and had sent his own physician to attend to the injury. Another time, I discovered him in his study reviewing requests for assistance from various charitable organizations. Rather than delegating such matters to his secretary, he was personally reading each appeal and making notes about which deserved support. His generosity was substantial, but entirely private. He sought no recognition or praise for his philanthropy. This Alexander, thoughtful, generous, carrying such deep pain beneath his reserved exterior, was someone I found myself wanting to know more completely. The attraction I felt was no longer merely physical, though heaven knew that existed. I had begun to admire him, to respect the man he had forced himself to become after tragedy, and to wish, quite desperately, that he might allow me closer to the parts of himself he kept so carefully guarded. The realization that I was developing genuine feelings for my husband of convenience was both thrilling and terrifying. We had agreed to a marriage based on practical considerations, not emotional entanglement. What right did I have to desire more when we had both explicitly committed to less? Yet desire it I did, with growing intensity that made our continued formality increasingly difficult to maintain. The tension between us seemed to build with each passing day. Our evening conversations grew longer, ranging from the superficial to the surprisingly intimate. We began to anticipate each other's needs and preferences with the ease of long-married couples, rather than near strangers. And the air between us crackled with unspoken awareness whenever we were in the same room. It came to a head one evening in the library. I had been reading by the fire when Alexander entered, carrying a book he wished to show me. He sat beside me on the sofa, closer than he typically positioned himself, and opened the volume to a particularly beautiful passage. As he read aloud, his voice low and rich with emotion, I found myself watching his face rather than following the words on the page. When he finished and looked up, our eyes met and held. Something passed between us in that moment, recognition perhaps of feelings neither of us had intended to develop. His gaze dropped to my lips, and I saw his control waver, saw him lean infinitesimally closer, as though drawn by a force he could not entirely resist. Then he caught himself, pulled back, and stood abruptly. He apologized for disturbing me and retreated from the library with obvious haste, leaving me alone with my racing heart and the uncomfortable awareness that our carefully constructed arrangement was becoming far more complicated than either of us had anticipated. That night, lying in my bed, I acknowledged the truth I had been avoiding. I was falling in love with Alexander Blackwood, and I had no idea whether such feelings could ever be reciprocated by a man who had built such formidable walls around his heart. The invitation arrived on a gray morning in early October, delivered with the day's correspondence on a silver salver. Lady Pemberton was hosting a ball, one of the season's most anticipated events, and as the Duke and Duchess of Ravenshire, our attendance was not merely requested, but expected. I read the elegant script with a mixture of resignation and anxiety. This would be our first major social appearance together since our marriage, and I knew the Ton would be watching us, with the avidity of hawks circling prey. Alexander received the news with his characteristic composure when I mentioned it over dinner that evening. He acknowledged that we could not avoid such obligations indefinitely, and suggested we use the event to definitively quell any lingering gossip about the circumstances of our marriage. A united front, he called it, presented with sufficient conviction to silence even the most determined scandal-mongers. The week preceding the ball was consumed with preparations. A new gown was commissioned, a creation of midnight blue silk that Mrs. Winters assured me would be appropriately magnificent for a duchess. My jewel case was opened to reveal the Ravenshire diamonds, a spectacular parure that had adorned generations of duchesses and now fell to me to wear. The weight of tradition, both literal and figurative, settled upon my shoulders with increasing heaviness. The evening of the ball arrived with startling swiftness. Sarah dressed me with meticulous care, arranging my hair in an elaborate style adorned with diamond pins. The gown fit perfectly, transforming me into someone I barely recognized, a woman of elegance and consequence rather than the uncertain girl who had been humiliated on her wedding night mere weeks ago. When I descended the stairs to meet Alexander in the entrance hall, I found him waiting in his formal evening attire, looking every inch the powerful Duke his title proclaimed. But when his eyes found me on the staircase, something flickered in their depths, something hot and possessive that made my breath catch in my throat. He said nothing as he helped me into my cloak, but his hands lingered at my shoulders a moment longer than necessary. In the carriage, he sat across from me as always, yet the space between us felt charged with an electricity I did not fully understand. Lady Pemberton's townhouse blazed with light, music, and laughter spilling from its windows into the London street. We joined the queue of carriages depositing guests, and I felt my anxiety mounting with each passing moment. This was the crucible in which our marriage would be judged by society. Would we be accepted as a legitimate couple, or would the whispers about our unusual circumstances follow us indefinitely? Alexander must have sensed my tension, for he reached across the carriage and took my hand in his. The gesture was simple, yet profoundly comforting. He assured me that we would manage admirably, that I looked every inch a duchess, and that anyone who dared suggest otherwise would answer to him personally. The fierce protectiveness in his voice sent warmth flooding through me. Our entrance caused precisely the stir I had anticipated. Conversations paused as we were announced, and I felt countless eyes assessing us with unconcealed curiosity. But Alexander kept my hand firmly tucked into his arm, guiding me through the crowds with an authority that brooked no challenge. We greeted our hostess with appropriate courtesy, accepted congratulations on our marriage with gracious smiles, and began the careful dance of social navigation that such events demanded. The evening proceeded tolerably well at first. I danced the requisite sets with various gentlemen of appropriate rank, made polite conversation with dowagers and debutantes alike, and generally conducted myself with what I hoped was ducal propriety. Alexander remained nearby always, his presence a solid, reassuring anchor in the social tempest. It was during a moment when I had stepped away to take refreshment that Lord Gerald Hastings approached me. I knew him by reputation, a younger son of an earl, known for his charm and his somewhat questionable pursuit of wealthy women. He engaged me in conversation that began innocuously enough, but gradually took on undertones that made me distinctly uncomfortable. He spoke of my beauty with excessive familiarity, asked pointed questions about my marriage with barely concealed impertinence, and positioned himself far too close for propriety. When I attempted to excuse myself, he caught my arm, actually laid hands upon me, and suggested with a knowing smile that a woman in an arranged marriage might welcome certain attentions her husband could not provide. The implication was clear and utterly insulting. Heat flooded my face, though whether from embarrassment or anger I could not say. I was formulating a scathing response when a voice cut through the space between us like a blade. Alexander's tone was deceptively soft, yet it carried an edge of menace that made Lord Hastings release my arm as though burned. My husband materialized at my side, with a speed that suggested he had been monitoring my interactions more closely than I had realized. He positioned himself slightly in front of me, a physical barrier between Hastings and myself, and the look he directed at the other man could have frozen the Thames in midsummer. He suggested, with terrifying politeness, that Lord Hastings had business elsewhere that required his immediate attention. The implied threat beneath those words was unmistakable. Hastings, whatever his other failings, was not fool enough to challenge the Duke of Ravenshire. He offered stammering apologies and retreated with remarkable haste, but Alexander was not finished. His hand found the small of my back, possessive and warm through the silk of my gown, and he guided me through the ballroom with deliberate purpose. His movements made a statement to everyone present: "This woman is mine, and any who forget that fact do so at their peril." We ended up on the terrace, away from the crowds, where the cool night air helped clear my head. Alexander released me but did not step away. Instead, he looked at me with an intensity that made my heart pound against my ribs. He asked if Hastings had harmed me, if I was well, if I required anything. His concern was palpable, real, and it cracked something open inside my chest. I assured him I was unharmed, merely startled by such audacity, but I also admitted, with perhaps more honesty than was wise, that his intervention had been most welcome. Something shifted in his expression then. The careful control he maintained so rigorously seemed to slip, revealing beneath it a man struggling with emotions far more complex than our arrangement was meant to accommodate. He stepped closer, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his body, and when he spoke, his voice was rough with barely suppressed feeling. He informed me that no one, absolutely no one, would be permitted to treat me with such disrespect. That I was his duchess, under his protection, and any who forgot that would learn the error of their judgment swiftly and thoroughly. But beneath the possessive declaration, I heard something else, something that sounded remarkably like fear. Fear that someone might harm me, fear that I might be unhappy, fear that our arrangement might not be sufficient to protect me from all the cruelties society could inflict. I found myself moving closer to him without conscious decision, drawn by a magnetism I no longer wished to resist. I told him, my voice barely above a whisper, that I had never felt safer than I did with him, that his protection meant more to me than he perhaps realized, that our marriage, practical arrangement though it might be, had given me something precious, the security to be myself, without fear of judgment or exploitation. His eyes darkened at my words, his gaze dropping to my lips with unmistakable hunger. For a long moment we stood suspended in time, balanced on the knife's edge between restraint and surrender. I could see him warring with himself, see his desire battling against his determination to maintain the boundaries we had established. Then he stepped back, physically removing himself from temptation, though I saw the effort it cost him. He suggested we return to the ballroom before our absence was noted, and caused additional gossip. His tone had returned to its customary formality, but I heard the strain beneath it. We rejoined the party, and the remainder of the evening passed without incident. But something fundamental had changed between us. The careful distance we had maintained had been irrevocably breached. We both knew it, though neither of us acknowledged it aloud. The carriage ride home was conducted in charged silence. Alexander sat across from me as always, but I felt his attention on me like a physical touch. When we arrived at Ravenshire Hall and he escorted me to my chambers, his hand at my elbow burned even through my gloves. Outside my door, he paused. For a moment I thought, hoped, he might kiss me, might finally acknowledge the attraction that crackled between us. Instead, He lifted my hand to his lips in a gesture that was both perfectly proper and thoroughly devastating. His mouth pressed against my gloved knuckles, his eyes never leaving mine, and I felt that touch reverberate through my entire body. He bid me good night and departed toward his own chambers, leaving me trembling with emotions I could barely name. I entered my rooms in a daze, allowing Sarah to help me undress while my mind replayed every moment of the evening. That night, I lay in my bed unable to sleep, thinking about Alexander's fierce protectiveness, about the heat in his eyes when he looked at me, about the careful control he exercised over himself. I thought about my own feelings, which had evolved so far beyond what our arrangement was meant to encompass. I was in love with him, desperately, completely, irrevocably in love with the man I had married for convenience and protection. And tonight, for the first time, I had seen evidence that perhaps, just perhaps, those feelings might not be entirely unrequited, but loving Alexander meant risking the very real possibility that he might never allow himself to love me in return. He had locked his heart away after Amelia's death, and I did not know if any key existed that could open it again. The question that haunted me as I finally drifted toward sleep was whether I was brave enough to try to find one. The following days brought a subtle shift in our dynamic that was impossible to ignore. Alexander sought my company more frequently, often without any particular purpose beyond simply being near me. Our library sessions grew longer, our conversations more intimate. He began sharing details of his work, asking my opinion on estate matters and business decisions, treating me truly as a partner rather than merely a wife in name. And there were touches, deliberate now rather than accidental. His hand at the small of my back as we walked through the gardens, his fingers brushing mine when we both reached for the same book. The way he would stand behind my chair at dinner, his presence solid and warm, before taking his own seat. We were circling each other, I realized, like dancers learning the steps to a complicated waltz, neither of us quite ready to commit fully, yet unable to maintain the distance we had initially established. It was exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure. I found myself watching him constantly, noticing details I had overlooked before. The way his eyes crinkled slightly when he was genuinely amused, how he absently ran his hand through his hair when frustrated with correspondence, the rare, devastating smile that transformed his entire countenance when something truly pleased him. And I caught him watching me as well. His gaze would follow me across rooms, linger on my face during conversations, trace my movements with an intensity that made my skin feel too warm. He was no longer making any effort to hide his awareness of me, and the knowledge that he desired me, even if he would not act upon that desire, sent heat pooling in places I barely understood. The tension built between us like a gathering storm, and I knew, with a certainty that both thrilled and frightened me, that something would have to break. We could not continue this careful dance indefinitely. Eventually, one of us would have to acknowledge what was growing between us, would have to decide whether to embrace it or retreat permanently behind the safety of our original arrangement. I only hoped, when that moment came, we would have the courage to choose honestly. The letter arrived during breakfast, delivered with the morning post on a tray that the footman set before Alexander with his usual discretion. I was seated across from him, a new development in our evolving relationship, as he had begun taking his morning meal with me rather than sequestering himself in his study. We had been discussing plans for improvements to the tenant cottages, a conversation that felt remarkably natural and companionable, when I saw his expression darken as he read the missive. His jaw tightened, his knuckles whitening as his grip on the paper intensified. Whatever the letter contained, it had transformed his mood from the relative warmth I had begun to coax from him to something cold and dangerous. When he finally looked up, his eyes held a fury I had never witnessed before. He informed me, his voice carefully controlled despite the anger radiating from him, that Henry had apparently decided our quiet dissolution was insufficient for his purposes. My former husband, it seemed, had been spreading rumors throughout London. Vicious, calculated lies designed to destroy my reputation and, by extension, cast aspersions upon Alexander's judgment in marrying me. The accusations were as predictable as they were false. Henry was claiming that our marriage had been consummated, that I had proven unfaithful even on our wedding night, and that Alexander had been duped into marrying damaged goods. He was painting himself as the wronged party, the honorable man who had discovered his wife's perfidy and nobly agreed to an annulment rather than publicly shame her family. The audacity of his lies stole my breath. That he could transform his own cruelty and betrayal into accusations against me seemed almost incomprehensible. Yet I knew enough of society to understand that such rumors, once planted, could take root regardless of their veracity. The Ton thrived on scandal, and a story this salacious would spread through London's drawing rooms like wildfire. I felt the blood drain from my face as the implications crystallized. This was not merely an attack on my character. It was an assault on Alexander's reputation as well. By suggesting he had been fooled, that he had married a woman of questionable virtue, Henry was striking at the very foundation of Alexander's standing in society. And he was doing so from a position of calculated malice, knowing that defending ourselves would require revealing details of that humiliating night that I had hoped never to discuss publicly. Alexander rose from the table with barely contained violence, the chair scraping harshly against the floor. He began pacing the length of the breakfast room, his movements those of a predator contemplating the best method of destroying its prey. I had never seen him so utterly furious, yet his anger seemed directed not at me, but on my behalf, a distinction that warmed me even in the midst of my own distress. He assured me, his voice low and deadly, that Henry would regret this course of action, that no one attacked what belonged to the Duke of Ravenshire without suffering consequences, that he would see Henry utterly destroyed for daring to threaten me in this manner. The possessiveness in his declaration should perhaps have alarmed me, yet instead, I found it profoundly comforting. Here was proof that I was not merely a convenient arrangement to him, not simply a means to an heir. His fury was personal, protective, and entirely on my behalf, but I also recognized that this crisis demanded more than anger. However justified, we needed strategy, careful planning, and the sort of calculated response that would not only refute Henry's lies, but prevent any similar attacks in the future. I rose from my own chair and approached Alexander, placing my hand gently on his arm to still his pacing. I told him that we needed to be intelligent about this, that rushing into confrontation might play into Henry's hands. He was clearly desperate. His debts must have grown even more pressing, and he likely hoped to extort money from us in exchange for retracting his claims. We needed to expose not just the falseness of his accusations, but the motivations behind them. Alexander looked at me with something approaching wonder, as though seeing me anew. He acknowledged that my assessment was correct, that I possessed a clarity of thought he was currently lacking due to his rage. Then he did something entirely unexpected. He pulled me into his arms, holding me against his chest with a fierceness that spoke of emotions far beyond our practical arrangement. I felt his heart pounding against my cheek, felt the tension thrumming through his body, and allowed myself to sink into his embrace. For a long moment we simply stood there, drawing comfort and strength from each other's presence. When he finally released me, his expression had shifted from pure fury to something more controlled, more dangerous, the look of a man who had decided upon a course of action and would pursue it with ruthless efficiency. The following days were a whirlwind of careful maneuvering. Alexander deployed his considerable resources to investigate Henry's current circumstances, and what emerged painted a picture of a man drowning in debt far deeper than anyone had realized. He owed money to some of London's most dangerous creditors, men who were not known for their patience or mercy when payments came due. More damning still, Alexander's investigators uncovered evidence of Henry's ongoing relationship with Lady Isabel Morton, including receipts for apartments he had rented for their assignations and letters that made clear the nature of their attachment. The man who was claiming injury to his honor was simultaneously maintaining a mistress he had been seeing since before our marriage. But the most valuable piece of information came from an unexpected source. One of Henry's former servants, dismissed without pay when he could no longer afford the wages, approached Alexander's man of business with an offer. In exchange for the money he was owed, he would testify to having witnessed Henry's abandonment of me on our wedding night, his departure to Lady Morton's rooms, and his explicit statements about marrying me solely for my dowry. It was exactly the sort of corroborating evidence we needed, yet I hesitated when Alexander presented it to me. Using a servant's testimony felt somehow distasteful, even though the man was merely offering truth in exchange for wages rightfully owed. I expressed my concerns, worried that we would be seen as buying testimony, which could backfire spectacularly. Alexander listened to my reservations with patience, then explained his broader strategy. The servant's testimony would not be deployed publicly. That would indeed appear suspicious. Instead, it would be used privately, shown to key members of society whose opinions carried weight, accompanied by the financial evidence of Henry's debts and the documentation of his relationship with Lady Morton. The story would spread through whispers rather than proclamations, gaining credibility precisely because it was not being shouted from the rooftops. Moreover, Alexander intended to call in certain debts of his own, not financial ones, but the sort of social obligations that bound the ton together. He had done favors for influential people over the years, had kept secrets and provided assistance when needed. Now he would collect on those debts, ensuring that Henry found doors closed to him throughout London, that invitations ceased arriving, and that his presence became increasingly unwelcome in respectable society. It was a masterful plan, as elegant as it was ruthless. Rather than engaging in direct confrontation that might generate sympathy for Henry as the weaker party, we would simply allow him to destroy himself through his own actions, while ensuring that society witnessed his destruction through the proper lens. But there was one additional element Alexander insisted upon. We needed to present ourselves as unassailably united. Any hint of discord between us would give Henry's lies purchase. Therefore, we would need to appear in public together more frequently, demonstrating through our every interaction that ours was a marriage of genuine affection and mutual respect. The irony was not lost on either of us. We would need to play act the very feelings we had been so carefully avoiding acknowledging. Or perhaps, I thought with a flutter in my chest, we would simply need to allow ourselves to display openly what we had been suppressing. Our first public appearance following Henry's rumors was at the theatre, a production of Shakespeare that drew all of fashionable London. We arrived together, Alexander's hand possessive at my waist as he guided me to our box. I wore the Ravenshire emeralds, a different parure than the diamonds, equally magnificent, and a gown that Alexander had personally selected, claiming it brought out the color of my eyes. The attention we attracted was immediate and intense. Every eye in the theater seemed fixed upon us, measuring our interactions for signs of the discord Henry's rumors had suggested, so Alexander made certain to give them nothing of the sort. He sat beside me rather than in a separate chair, his body angled toward mine in a posture of attentive intimacy. His hand rested on the back of my seat, occasionally brushing my shoulder in gestures that appeared casual but felt deliberately possessive. During the intervals, he remained at my side, his attention apparently wholly focused on me, rather than on the social machinations occurring throughout the theater. And when certain ladies attempted to engage him in conversation, women who had perhaps hoped the rumors of our troubled marriage might present opportunities, he deflected them with a courtesy that barely masked his disinterest, making clear that his duchess was the only woman commanding his attention. I found myself responding to his performance, if indeed it was a performance, with a naturalness that surprised me. I leaned into his touch, smiled up at him with genuine warmth, and allowed myself to appear exactly as I felt, a woman deeply attached to her husband. If society wished to observe our relationship, let them see the truth of my feelings, even if Alexander's remained carefully guarded. The evening was a success by any measure. By the time we departed, the whispers had shifted noticeably. Where before there had been speculation about the state of our marriage, now there was admiration for the obvious connection between us. Henry's rumors began to appear exactly as they were, the desperate fabrications of a jealous, discredited man. But the true test came several days later, at a dinner party hosted by the Marchioness of Westfield, one of society's most influential hostesses. Henry himself was in attendance, a surprise that suggested he had not yet realized how thoroughly his social position had eroded. When we were announced and entered the drawing room, I saw him across the space, his expression twisting into something ugly as he observed us. Alexander felt my tension and covered my hand with his, the gesture both comforting and claiming. We circulated through the room, greeting other guests with perfect courtesy, and I was acutely aware of the growing coldness with which Henry was being received. Conversations died when he approached. People found reasons to excuse themselves from his proximity. The ostracism was subtle, but unmistakable. Dinner itself was a carefully orchestrated affair, and I found myself seated between two sympathetic ladies who spoke warmly of Alexander and our marriage. Across the table, I could see Henry growing increasingly agitated as he realized the extent to which opinion had turned against him. His face flushed with wine and anger, and I felt a prickle of apprehension as the meal progressed. The explosion came during the final course. Henry, apparently unable to contain himself any longer, rose unsteadily to his feet and addressed the table with the belligerence of a man who had consumed far too much alcohol. He demanded to know why he was being treated as a pariah when he was the wronged party. He pointed at me with a trembling finger and repeated his accusations, his voice rising to a near shout. The silence that followed was absolute. Every person at that table stared at Henry with varying degrees of shock and disapproval. The Marchioness, a woman of formidable presence, rose with icy dignity and informed him that he was no longer welcome in her home. But before she could summon footmen to escort him out, Alexander stood. His movement was unhurried, almost lazy, yet it commanded immediate attention. He did not raise his voice, did not display any obvious anger, yet the menace radiating from him was palpable. He addressed Henry with a courtesy that was somehow more devastating than any open hostility could have been. He suggested that Henry had perhaps consumed too much wine and was speaking from confusion rather than malice. He expressed sympathy for a man so burdened by debt that he might resort to desperate measures. And then, with surgical precision, he revealed just enough of what we knew: the extent of Henry's financial ruin, his relationship with Lady Morton, the testimony of servants who had witnessed his behavior, to make clear that any further attacks would result in complete and utter destruction. The threat was delivered with perfect politeness, couched in language that allowed everyone present to understand its full weight, while maintaining the veneer of civilized discourse. Henry paled, seeming to shrink before our eyes, as he recognized that he had been comprehensively outmaneuvered. He left the dinner party in disgrace, and I knew with certainty that we would not be troubled by him again. Alexander had not merely defended my honor. He had obliterated any threat Henry might pose, now or in the future. When we returned home that night, I found myself alone with Alexander in the library, the customary destination following any evening engagement. The fire had been lit, casting dancing shadows across the walls, and we stood before it in silence for a long moment. Then Alexander turned to me, and the expression on his face stole my breath. It held triumph, certainly, but also something deeper, something that looked remarkably like need. He told me that he could not bear to see me threatened, that the thought of anyone harming me had driven him to a fury he had not experienced since Amelia's death. And then, in a voice rough with emotion, he admitted that our arrangement had become something he had not anticipated, that I had become far more to him than he had intended to allow. It was not a declaration of love. Alexander was too guarded for such naked vulnerability, but it was an acknowledgement of feeling, an admission that the walls he had built were crumbling. And standing there in the firelight, with the man who had just defended me so fiercely looking at me with such intensity, I felt something settle into place within my heart. I was his, completely, and perhaps, just perhaps, he was beginning to realize that he was mine as well. The journey back to Ravenshire Hall after the confrontation with Henry should have felt triumphant. We had emerged victorious, my reputation preserved, and our marriage vindicated in the eyes of society. Yet the atmosphere in the carriage was thick with an entirely different tension, one that had been building between us for weeks, and had finally reached a breaking point. Alexander sat across from me in his customary position, but there was nothing customary about the way he looked at me. The careful control he typically maintained had fractured, revealing beneath it something raw and hungry that made my pulse race. We did not speak during the drive, yet the silence was heavy with everything we had been avoiding saying. When we arrived home, he handed me down from the carriage with hands that lingered at my waist. We entered the house together, and the servants who greeted us must have sensed something in the air, for they made themselves scarce with remarkable efficiency. We stood in the entrance hall, ostensibly removing our outer garments, yet I was acutely aware that we were circling each other like we had been for weeks, dancers who knew the steps, but had not yet committed to the music. Alexander suggested we retire to the library for our usual nightcap. I agreed, though we both knew this evening would be anything but usual. The library welcomed us with its familiar warmth, firelight casting long shadows across the walls. He poured brandy for us both, his movements precise despite the tension evident in every line of his body. I accepted the glass he offered, and our fingers brushed in the exchange. The touch, innocent as it was, sent heat flooding through me. We stood before the fire, ostensibly warming ourselves, yet the heat I felt had nothing to do with the flames crackling in the hearth. Finally, Alexander spoke. His voice was low, rough with emotion barely contained. He told me that he owed me an apology. When he had proposed our marriage of convenience, he had believed himself capable of maintaining the emotional distance such an arrangement required. He had thought his heart too damaged, too carefully protected to be touched again. He had been, he admitted with something approaching wonder, spectacularly wrong. I set down my glass with trembling hands, unable to trust myself to hold it steady. I asked him what he meant, though I knew. I had known for weeks, had seen it in his eyes and felt it in his touch, but I needed to hear him say it aloud. He moved closer, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his body, could see the pulse beating at his throat. He told me that I had somehow breached every defense he had constructed, that I occupied his thoughts constantly, that the idea of maintaining polite distance from me had become not merely difficult, but impossible. He confessed that watching Henry threaten me had revealed the depth of his feelings with brutal clarity. He was not merely protecting his duchess or defending his choice of wife. He was protecting the woman he loved. The words hung between us, shocking in their directness. I had hoped for such a confession, had dreamed of it during lonely nights in my separate chambers, yet hearing it spoken aloud left me momentarily speechless. When I finally found my voice, it emerged barely above a whisper. I told him that I had been terrified of loving him, of developing feelings for a man who had made clear he sought nothing beyond practical partnership. Yet despite my fears, despite my attempts at restraint, I had fallen completely and irrevocably in love with him. That every conversation, every shared moment in this library, every accidental touch had deepened my attachment until the thought of living without genuine connection to him had become unbearable. Alexander's control shattered. He closed the distance between us in a single stride, his hands coming up to frame my face with a gentleness that belied the intensity in his eyes. He asked if he might kiss me, not as a formality of our marriage, but as a man kisses the woman he loves. The request, so unlike the presumption many husbands would assume as their right, made my heart ache with tenderness. I gave him the only answer possible. I told him yes, that I had been waiting for this moment since the night he had stormed into my ruined wedding chamber and offered me salvation. When his lips met mine, it was nothing like the chaste kiss we had exchanged at our wedding. This was a claiming, a declaration, a promise all at once. His mouth moved over mine with a hunger that spoke of weeks of restraint finally released, and I responded with equal fervor, my hands tangling in his dark hair as I pressed closer to him. The kiss deepened, became more urgent, and I felt myself drowning in sensation. His hands moved from my face to my waist, pulling me flush against him, and I could feel the evidence of his desire, the proof that I affected him as profoundly as he affected me. When we finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, he rested his forehead against mine. He whispered that he had been a fool to think he could remain indifferent to me, that from the moment he had seen me standing in that bridal suite, abandoned and heartbroken yet refusing to crumble, he had been lost. He had told himself his intervention was merely practical, that his proposal was simply logical, but he had been lying to himself. He had wanted me from the beginning, had desired not just a convenient duchess, but this particular woman with her sharp mind and stubborn courage. I confessed my own truth in return, that I had married him seeking safety and protection, but had found something infinitely more precious. I had discovered a partner who valued my intelligence, a protector who respected my autonomy, and a man whose layers of complexity and carefully hidden kindness had captivated me completely. He kissed me again, and this time the passion was edged with tenderness. When he lifted his head, his eyes held a question. We were man and wife in law, he acknowledged, but not yet in truth. He would not press me, would not assume, but if I wished it, if I truly wished it, he would make our marriage real in every sense of the word. The formal proposal, so characteristic of Alexander's careful honor, made me smile even as tears pricked my eyes. I told him that I wished it more than I could express, that I wanted to be his wife not in name only, but in deed and truth, that I wanted to share not merely his name and his home, but his bed and his life. Something blazed in his eyes at my words, desire mixed with relief, and a devotion that took my breath away. He lifted me into his arms with surprising ease, and I gasped at the sudden movement. He asked, with a hint of his rare smile, if I objected to him carrying his bride to bed as tradition demanded. I assured him I had no objections whatsoever, and he carried me from the library, through corridors I barely registered, to a chamber I had never entered, his own. The room was unmistakably masculine, decorated in deep blues and rich woods, dominated by a massive bed that looked like it could accommodate a small army. He set me down gently beside it, his hands trembling slightly as they moved to the fastenings of my gown. The vulnerability in that tremor touched me deeply. This powerful man, always so controlled, was nervous about this intimacy we were about to share. I reached up to still his hands and told him we had all the time we needed, that there was no rush. He nodded, seeming to gather himself, and proceeded with more confidence. My gown fell away in stages, revealing the delicate undergarments beneath, until I stood before him in nothing but my chemise and my courage. His gaze as he looked at me held such reverence that I felt beautiful in a way I never had before. He traced the line of my jaw with gentle fingers, then bent to press kisses along my throat that made me shiver with pleasure. I reached for his clothing in turn, fumbling slightly with unfamiliar fastenings until he helped me, and soon he stood before me equally undressed, firelight gilding the planes of his body. We came together on that bed with a passion tempered by tenderness, and what followed was both everything I had imagined and far beyond anything my limited experience could have prepared me for. Alexander was an attentive lover, patient with my inexperience, careful of my comfort, yet urgent in his desire. When we finally joined, the momentary discomfort was swept away by the profound sense of rightness, of completion, of two halves finally becoming whole. Afterward, I lay in his arms, my head resting on his chest, where I could hear his heart beating strong and steady. He stroked my hair with gentle hands and told me things I had never expected to hear from him. Declarations of love, promises of fidelity, assurances that he would spend the rest of his life proving himself worthy of the gift I had given him. I assured him in return that he had already proven himself, that from the moment he had offered me escape from humiliation, through every kindness shown and confidence shared, he had demonstrated the quality of his character. I loved not the title he bore or the protection he provided, but the man himself, complex, damaged, deeply honorable, and capable of far more feeling than he had believed possible. We talked long into the night, sharing fears and hopes and dreams we had kept private. He told me about Amelia, about the guilt he had carried that he could not save her, about his terror of loving again and facing that helplessness in the face of loss. I shared my own fears, that I might never be enough, that our marriage of convenience might always feel like second best, that I might spend my life loving someone who could not fully love me in return. He dispelled that last fear with passionate conviction. I was not second best, he insisted, but rather the woman he had not known he was waiting for. His love for Amelia had been the love of youth, intense, uncomplicated, and untested by real adversity. What he felt for me was deeper, richer, built on genuine partnership and mutual respect. I had seen him at his worst and loved him anyway. I had challenged him, matched wits with him, and proven myself his equal in every way that mattered. The days and weeks that followed marked a transformation in our marriage that felt nothing short of miraculous. We abandoned the pretense of separate chambers, our nights spent in shared intimacy that was by turns passionate and tender. Our days took on a new quality as well. We became true partners in every aspect, working together to manage the estates, discussing business and social obligations as equals, and finding joy in simple companionship. The library remained our sanctuary, but now we sat together rather than carefully apart, my feet tucked beneath me as I leaned against Alexander's shoulder while he read aloud. We took long walks through the grounds, planning improvements and discussing dreams for the future. We hosted dinners and attended social functions, presenting to the world a united front that was no longer performance, but pure truth. Society, which had watched our marriage with such speculation, eventually accepted what was plain to see. The Duke and Duchess of Ravenshire were genuinely, obviously devoted to each other. Our story became the sort of romantic tale the ton loved, the rescued bride and her noble duke, a marriage of convenience transformed by love. 6 months into our marriage, I discovered I was with child. When I told Alexander, his reaction was everything I could have hoped for. Joy mixed with tender concern, excitement tempered by protectiveness. He fussed over me with an attentiveness that would have been comical had it not been so touching, ensuring I wanted for nothing, and treating me as though I were made of the most delicate porcelain. The pregnancy progressed without complication, and on a spring morning when the gardens were in full bloom, I gave birth to a healthy son. We named him Thomas, after Alexander's father, and when Alexander held his heir for the first time, I saw tears glisten in his eyes, tears of joy, of relief, of gratitude for the family we had created. Looking at my husband cradling our son, at the transformation love had wrought in both of us, I marveled at the strange path that had brought us together. My first wedding night had been my greatest humiliation, yet it had led me to this, to a man who loved me deeply and completely, to a partnership built on honesty and respect, to a family I had not dared dream of in those dark moments when Henry abandoned me. Alexander looked up and met my gaze, and in his eyes I saw reflected my own wonder and gratitude. He told me, as he had countless times since that night in the library when we finally admitted our feelings, that I was his salvation, as much as he had been mine, that he had been merely existing before I entered his life, going through the motions of duty without joy or hope, that I had taught him it was possible to love again, to risk his heart, and find it returned with equal devotion. I reached for his hand, and he grasped mine tightly, our fingers interlacing in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. We had begun as strangers bound by convenience, but we had become something far more precious, partners, lovers, best friends, and devoted spouses. The humiliation of my wedding night to Henry seemed like something from another lifetime, a necessary darkness that had led me to light. I had belonged to Alexander from that first moment when he strode into my ruined bridal chamber, though neither of us had known it then. But now, holding our son while my husband looked at us with such love, I knew the truth with unshakable certainty. I belonged to him, and he to me, completely and eternally. And that belonging was not loss of self, but rather the most profound freedom I had ever known, the freedom to be truly seen, truly known, and truly loved. Our story had begun with scandal and pain, but it had transformed into something beautiful, and as I looked toward our future, years of partnership and passion, children yet to be born, a life built on foundation of genuine love, I could not imagine anything more perfect. Some marriages are built on romantic fantasy that crumbles under the weight of reality. Ours had been built on honest practicality and had blossomed into something far exceeding any fantasy I might have imagined. We had found not just passion, but partnership, not just desire, but devotion, not just a marriage of convenience, but a love that would endure for all our days. And I knew, with the same certainty that had led me to place my hand in his all those months ago, that I would choose this, would choose him, again and again for the rest of my life.